So the first thing I would like to start with is the Banksy mural that just recently kind of surfaced in North England. And I just took it because I wanted to make absolutely clear that to me, peace building and communicating peace has a lot to do with making structural violence visible. And how does this work, and how do we address and mediate structural forms, environmental, gendered, racialized forms of violence that are often the underlying reasons for conflict and that reproduce themselves even after conflict? So for me, there is a physical reality in the mural, which is really, it's a physical dead tree. And it is the artist, the mediator, that has to create something green around it in order to give it the impression of being alive. So there is a sense that conflict resolution and peace building has to take a much larger, and I would even say planetary view, in order to function long term. Next slide. So my own trajectory is a really kind of a little bit odd, and I'm not sure how it is within the collection of essays that you compiled now. But as a humanities scholar, I'm always somehow on the fringe of things, because methodologies within the social sciences and the humanities do not always gel, and they become very difficult to mediate. But my own work, since I've been a postdoctoral student and even before, has always been a kind of interwoven into para and pluridisciplinary research teams. So one of the central questions that emerged from this kind of work to me, and this is always in response to social scientists, is, how do literary texts imagine responses to structural violence, global civil wars, etc., in ways that more pragmatic theories of war and politics and peace building cannot? And how do we then end up reading these texts in ways that are hopefully not as instrumental as many social scientists like to take them for? So a couple of premises that I have for the chapter as well as for the blog, they're not as expressed in the chapter, but they're really underlying. Is that first is that peace building involves, to me, diverse political and cultural mediations and forms of activism that address and rescript the multifaceted entanglements of structural violence and reparation, both at home and abroad. So that peace building really requires a change in mindset. And I think for this, literature is a wonderful tool in a way. And it is important, however, to always recognize that literature cannot but be political. This is a myth to think that literature and art are in any way autonomous. This is what CIA during the Cold War propagated through its arts program across the world. So autonomy is as much a myth as political instrumentality. So then how do we look at it? And my take is always a post-colonial in various ways. Now it is a planetary, because I think literature shapes social and cultural structures of feelings, reference, and attitude, and thereby creates various imaginaries. And I think that is where the peace building project and communication project about peace comes in. So next slide, please. The chapter addresses a number of child soldier narratives, and it makes a case for what I call post-conflict narratives. Normally people speak about peace literature. I speak about post-conflict narratives. And I see them as liminal, translational, relational, and not always successful narratives of peace building on a communal and planetary scale. And it argues, my chapter argues, that attentive and reparative readings of conflict and post-conflict narrative practice peace building not as a telos, but as an open, messy, polyphonous process. You see already here the humanities methodologies kick in, very theoretical, very text heavy, but at the same time, I think it is a very useful way to look at it. Reparative reading practice is something that I take from Eve Sedgwick. So I'm actually turning in the chapter to queer theory in order to analyze peace building processes, because that kind of turn hasn't been really done very often within that context. So I'm therefore also trying to focus our gaze not on the subject to whom peace must be delivered in a way, but really back onto the production of the reader as an active participant in that peace building process. So for that reason, I kind of discussed several narratives, but just very cursively, really. There's this Beast of No Nation, which is a novel by Nigerian, but based in the States, Uzodinma Iweala. This, of course, you might know the best because it was turned into a movie. I think it's a humanitarianist narrative, but I mean, it's something one can discuss later. And then a very provocative novel, Allah is Not Obliged, by Amadou Kourouma, which was first published in French and is really all about the work of translation as a means of peace building. Song of Night, very controversial, very short, very teachable novel by Chris Abani, also a Nigerian, is about a child soldier who is actually dead but doesn't know it. And so the narrative comes through a very uncanny and very spectral voice. And then the last one is a little kind of coincidental, because Jenny Erpenbeck just yesterday won the International Booker Prize for Kairos. But I personally love her piece, Go When Gone. It's a novel about the refugee crisis in Germany and in Europe in 2012 to 14. And it narrates really the becoming of a reparative reader who must unlearn his privileges in order to rethink what peace might mean. And that includes a letting go of one's understandings of national sovereignty and property rights. I think these are very foundational issues. Next slide, please. So normally when we think about literature, or we think about peace literature, we think instantly, I think perhaps of literature of engagement. This would be Sartre's term, political literature, literature of commitment. But, and I'm not reading this out right now, but I think my point here is to say that peace literature is, as Frantz Fanon had argued, combative. It speaks truth to power, as Edward Said says, but, and this is my point, it risks being prescriptive, homogenizing, didactic, and it often speaks for vulnerable community, assuming that they do not have a critical consciousness, but that it needs to be given to them. So for me, in those kinds of approaches, you have what I call an instrumental fallacy, a hermeneutic fallacy that always wants to know and expose what's gone wrong instead of looking towards more generative processes. Or I think what is most rampant in social sciences is the idea that there is truth, verisimility, or authorial truth in a text, which is why many kind of flock towards memorials and testimonies, assuming that these have not been mediated by language or often co-produced by others. So to me, one of the definitions of peace literature that I like to contest is by Anthony Adolph, who says that peace literature reads literatures of war and post-war in various social, historical, economic, and political contexts, which is true, and it must be done like this, but it cultivates Western democratic, civic, and moral virtues such as tolerance and unity and diversity. And I think that that is presumptive. The values and genealogies of peace building there remain Eurocentric. They fail to address structural violence, and they maintain the idea of national sovereignty, immobility, so border politics and property rights as sacrosanct. We are not touching those, even though we try to impose peace elsewhere or somewhere. So to me, thematic and instrumental readings of conflict narratives pay therefore little attention to the fraught and self-perpetuating relationship between aesthetics, politics, and violence. And there is a lesson to be learned from Benjamin. Next slide, please. And I'm not going through it, but I think you might all, as media researchers, know exactly what I'm talking about. The idea that the politicization of violence or the aestheticization of politics very often kind of has or is taken into the service of ultra-conservative fascist politics. And some of the things that you can see here, I took two of the most often quoted passages from Benjamin at the end of his work on mechanical art, photography and mechanical art. And what I think maybe the emphasis here is that if you look at the still from Apocalypse Now on the bottom, it's it uses also wide angle and aerial shots in order to show the bombing, napalm bombings, of course, of Vietnam. And so one could say this is an anti-war movie, as some have said, but on the other hand, follow Baudrillard, it's one of the most, martial movies ever made. And it has to do with the aestheticization. So with the form, not with the content. So here's my point again. It's not about theme. It's not about what is being said. It's about how it is being said that engages in peace building. Can I have the next slide, please? If I'm out of time, I'm just jumping to the summary. Am I out of time? Yes?
No, not yet, not yet.
Okay. So I'm just going to give you, I'm not going to read all of these. So for Kuruma, Allah is not obliged. What interests me there is the idea of unfaithful translations. The narrator is a child soldier, and he describes himself as rude as a goat's beard and equipped with a foul-mouthed attitude thrown in for good treasure, not for good measure, but for good treasure. And of course, there's reason to it. And he kind of wildly translates and mistranslates and misdirects using 4 colonial dictionaries in order to kind of unhinge the reference systems that he had kind of inherited through colonialism, but also through humanitarian interventions and peace making missions. So for me, Birahima's necessarily unfaithful translations not only force the reader into the role of the translator, because this is where we end up being, but they also suggest that reparative peace building must begin with unsettling the very terms and languages through which it operates. So it was also interesting that we're only tweeting in English, right? What you said earlier. So there is a lot of language politics already involved in how we determine things. And of course, this is also one of the insights that decolonial philosophers like Walter Mignolo, for instance, kind of tries to always bring home to us. Have the next slide, please. And reparative reading and transitional peace building, this is about liminality. And here, what I find very interesting in Abani's Song for Night is the experimental ideas. So as child mind diffusers, those children that were part in an unnamed country's army had their vocal cords cut so that they would perform better and not scream while they were diffusing. This is fiction. So he says right at the beginning, so I do not speak to you. I do sign language. And the sign language even is in Igbo. So where does that leave the reader? what are the projections that we need to do and undo? 2 minutes?
2 minutes.
Okay, perfect. So what we have here, well, you know what? I will let you read this later on at the in the chapter. Can we go to the next slide, please, very quickly? So, Go When Gone is the novel that I do discuss more extensively in the chapter, and there what becomes a very interesting turn of things is that the protagonist, who is an East German retired professor of classical philology, interacts with a number of refugees that live in his vicinity, and through various events and turns, etc., he is the one who must entirely unlearn his beliefs and put his history in many ways next to the histories of the refugees. But he is the one in this case who has to take some risks by opening up and practice his home and practicing absolute hospitality in Derridian terms. And so he also gives up most of his property and most of his ideas of what it means to be a sovereign human subject, and understands learning as a process of co-evolution that starts from the despair of the other, not from his despair, which is also plenty. So it becomes interesting in this way, and it is organized around an actual event in Berlin that lasted for 2 years and was quite spectacular, the occupation of Berlin Oranienplatz, and the contestation of the Dublin regulation at the time. Can I have the last slide? So here, if we look at the summaries very quickly, conflict and post-conflict narratives do not offer singular, easily accessible resolutions to conflict, but they look at the multiple contradictions and genealogies and complicities of conflicts. They are experimental, speculative, visceral, planetary in various ways. They contest the controversial politics of recognition, property, and sovereignty. And post-conflict narratives remain vigilant at all times about the continuation of the origins of conflict and forms of violence that underlie them. And finally, reparative readings, then, I think, are transformative and generative practices of peace building that focus on the reader as a co-producer and not as a consumer of stories. That's it.